Faster, and with a longer range than other aircraft at the time, Mitsubishi's G4M was a true beacon of Japanese power during World War II. The Betty bomber had become instantly recognizable, as it was extensively used for bombing, kamikaze attacks, as a transport, and even during Japan's surrender. It was the most famous Japanese bomber of the war, and it was deployed in nearly every battle in the Pacific. At the beginning of its career, it attacked two of the most powerful ships in the Pacific, recording the first 2 kills of capital ships from the air. The plane's powerful symbolism, however, would eventually devolve to reflect the desperation of Japan towards the end of the war. In one of its final roles, it would serve as a mothership for the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a piloted kamikaze rocket launched in a futile attempt to repeal the American advance towards the Japanese homeland. The earlier G4M had been developed by Mitsubishi and entered service in China in 1937. Only 2 months after the plane came into service, the Imperial Japanese Navy sent the requirements to Mitsubishi Aircraft Company for the new aircraft. They wanted a twin-engine, land-based medium bomber that they would operate primarily during World War II. Mitsubishi was charged with developing an unprecedented bomber that pushed the limits of range and speed. The Japanese wanted a top speed of 247 miles per hour, 398 kilometers. The new bomber needed to climb to 9,800 feet, or 3,000 meters. Furthermore, they needed a plane that could travel far, with a range of 2,300 miles, or 3,700 kilometers, while lifting an 1,800-pound or 800-kilogram payload. Mitsubishi was faced with a daunting challenge, and they rose to the occasion and created the best land-based naval bomber at the time. The G4M Betty bomber was created as requested, with long range and high speed for the aircraft of the era. To meet the Imperial Japanese Navy's ambitious requirements, the team at Mitsubishi decided not to use self-sealing fuel tanks. Led by aircraft designer Kiro Honjo, they placed the fuel tanks on the wings. Furthermore, the designers decided not to use armor either. Similarly, shielding to protect the crew was also eschewed to keep weight down. Even some defensive weapons were omitted. While these features led to the goals that the Imperial Japanese Navy was looking for, they also made the aircraft and their crews highly vulnerable to cannons and machine guns. Allied fighter pilots even mocked the plane by referring to it with names such as the Flying Zippo or the One-Shot Lighter, since simply shooting the fuel tanks would make the whole thing go down in flames. Almost fueling the Allied jokes, the Japanese pilots referred to it as hamaki, meaning cigar. However, that nickname referred to its long, streamlined shape. For its armament, the G4M was given 7.7mm guns at the nose, to the side of the fuselage, and on top of it. The tail was also fitted with a 20mm cannon. The Betty bomber was highly effective against stationary targets, as its altitude made it hard to fight from land. The G4M could arrive almost suddenly and drop its payload before any fighters took off from the ground. The tail cannon was more devastating than the armament of other aircraft at the time, presenting a significant threat. One of the most surprising elements of the Betty was that it could remain airborne after being severely damaged. Sometimes its pilots wouldn't even notice they had received enemy fire. First flight. The first prototype of the Betty bomber was disassembled at the Mitsubishi Nagoya plant for transportation in September of 1939. The parts were placed into 5 carts and were drawn by ox to the Kagamigahara airfield, which was 30 miles north. The plane was reassembled and ready to fly by the end of October. On October 23, 1939, Katsushi Shima, Mitsubishi's chief test pilot, carried out its first flight. Although the flight and the subsequent tests were successful, the Imperial Japanese Navy decided against producing the ambitious aircraft at first. A better armed variant labeled G6M1 was seen as more promising, and they hoped it could be used as a heavy escort fighter next to bombers. When that model failed to meet expectations, Mitsubishi was ordered to produce the G4M Betty. The aircraft would become one of the most recognizable Japanese planes ever made. It served in almost all the engagements in the Pacific and played multiple roles. The aircraft went on to become a symbol of Japanese might, even in the years after the war. British vessels. The 2 British vessels attacked by the G4M Bettys were the HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse. HMS Prince of Wales was an advanced battleship at the time. Completed on March 31, 1941, the vessel counted on radar-guided firing and was armed with 10 14-inch guns and 80 UP projectors. She had a brand-new high-angle control system to target aircraft. The ship was incredibly promising, and an intimidating display of British power. In the ship's short career, it was sent to the Battle of the Denmark Strait to fight the German Bismarck ship. It was later sent to the battle immediately preceding the attack on Pearl Harbor, where it encountered the Japanese G4M airplane. HMS Repulse was an older battlecruiser. It was launched in 1916 and had a long and intense career both during the First World War and immediately after. It was refitted and upgraded several times, starting in 1939 when the Second World War began. While older, the vessel was sturdy and well-armed when it departed from Singapore to fight the Japanese. After Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the course of World War II was dramatically altered with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The very next day, Singapore Harbor was buzzing with aircraft, marking the beginning of the wider war in the Pacific. The HMS Prince of Wales and the HMS Repulse set out on their fateful voyage out of Singapore, along with 4 destroyers. Force Z, as the group of vessels was called, was the result of Admiral Sir Thomas Spencer Vaughan Phillips' initiative. He thought that by attacking from the rear, he would be able to cut the Japanese line of supplies and strand them. He was planning on arriving at the Battle of Songkhla, then called Singora, in Thailand. Force Z was plagued by mistakes from the start, yet Phillips chose to proceed. The high-angle control system on the Prince of Wales was failing due to the humidity, limiting its air defenses. Still, Phillips mistakenly believed that the ships were immune to intensive damage from aircraft, in part because no vessel had been sunk by aircraft, excluding the docked vessels at Pearl Harbor that were taken by surprise. Furthermore, he didn't know that Japanese planes could operate far from land, and was unaware of the capabilities of Japanese torpedoes. Phillips, as many Royal Navy officers did, thought that aircraft presented only a minor threat. Therefore, he declined the Royal Air Force's offer for cover. Battle. Just an hour after leaving port, the squadron was seen by Japanese aircraft. The Imperial Japanese sent a fleet of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers as a response. The forces traveled just 9 kilometers apart, but did not make contact due to the rainstorm blocking the view. The Prince of Wales's radar failed to show the Japanese planes. Accidentally, one of the Japanese pilots dropped a flare over their own cruiser, Chokai, which the British saw. Thinking they had been discovered, Phillips ordered his crew to return to Singapore. On the journey back, he received reports of the Japanese landing nearby. Still willing to engage, Force Z sought them out. On December 10th, the British destroyer HMS Tenedos, which was traveling at a distance from the squadron, radioed HMS Prince of Wales to report that it was being attacked by Japanese bomber aircraft. Minutes later, a Japanese scout plane found Force Z. The Japanese called off their attack on HMS Tenedos and headed north to attack the bigger fish. 8 G4Ms fell in HMS Repulse, but they only scored 1 hit that didn't cause any significant damage. 20 minutes or so later, more Japanese aircraft came from the horizon, diving to the height of torpedoes. The British put Force Z at maximum speed, trying to escape. 9 of these planes went for HMS Repulse, and 8 for HMS Prince of Wales. As the battle ensued, the British force fired at the aircraft, damaging 3 planes and taking 1 down. Still, 8 torpedoes traveled towards HMS Prince of Wales just below the surface. The captain maneuvered the ship in an attempt to escape, but one of the weapons hit its target. The port engine room saw a colossal explosion. The propeller shaft flew out of the ship, spinning at maximum speed and tearing the gasket on its way out. This allowed water to pour in. The engineers on board tried to fight the flooding by halting the engine while they repaired the damage. The Japanese aircraft returned to base temporarily. When the engineers turned the engine on again, the watertight gasket failed and let in 2,400 tons of water. The compartment was completely flooded, and as a result, the ship went from going at 20 knots to 26 knots. The vessel started tilting by over 11 degrees. The starboard guns were then unusable against low-flying torpedo bombers. All but 2 of the anti-aircraft guns were no longer usable. When they thought things couldn't look grimmer, the Japanese returned. 26 G4M Betty bombers came down on the flooding vessel. An array of torpedoes sped towards the underside of HMS Prince of Wales. The ship was barely staying afloat after 3 of the torpedoes met their target. Other Bettys attacked HMS Repulse in a pincer tactic. The ship was hit 4 times despite previously evading 19 torpedoes. The crew began abandoning ship. HMS Repulse completely overturned in only minutes. HMS Prince of Wales continued shooting at aircraft with its 2 remaining guns as it was being bombed. The deck amidships was hit, and the makeshift hospital was destroyed. The ship was also capsizing, so HMS Express and one of the destroyers came to the rescue of the remaining crew members. The bilge keel hit against the destroyer as the ship turned over, and almost sank it as well. Eventually, both British ships were swallowed by the ocean, thanks to the G4M Betty bombers. The Japanese returned to base as the remaining members of Force Z tried to rescue as many of their comrades as possible. In his memoirs, Churchill recalled his feelings about the battle, quote, "As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Over all this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked." ending the war. By the end of their production run, Mitsubishi had built 2,416 G4M Betty bombers. These played a role in almost all the battles and moments of the Second World War as bombers, special attack aircraft, kamikaze planes, and transports. Japanese hero and American antagonist Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was partially responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack, was being transported in one when he was shot down in 1943. The G4M even played a role at the end of the war. It carried the Japanese delegation that surrendered the country in August of 1945.